How you guys doing today? Good, good, good. What did you think of the last meeting? The librarians came and visited us the last meeting, talked to us about evaluating sources. How do you like the session? They're not here. Feel free, be honest. Yeah.
It was honestly more interesting than I thought.
More interesting than you thought it was? Library science. That should be their bumper sticker. More interesting than you think it's going to be. Yeah, I thought it was adorable that they thought the CRAAP test was naughty. Yeah. I was like, oh, honey. But yeah, it does stick with you. This is one of those things. In fact, there's going to be a point here as we're reviewing what the CRAAP test is. And by the way, I was talking to Amy, one of the two librarians, after our session, and I was saying, like, it looks like your CRAAP test, like, I don't know if test is really the right word. Maybe I'm being nitpicky here. But when I hear a test, I think of something that, like, when I'm done applying the test, I've got some idea of whether something is, like, passed or failed. And it seems like that the CRAAP test or the CRAAP system of evaluation, it was really, really close to our criteria of adequacy. It had the same sort of style as the criteria of adequacy when we were talking about critically comparing competing explanations. That, like, all of these criteria, if we're going to call them that, are things that they seem to have an all other things being equal provision, and it gets really, really complicated when I try to apply all of them at once. Just to kind of refresh our memory, and in fact, we might end up in a situation where like reasonable people might disagree about whether something is a good or reliable source or not, just because the complexity of these criteria and the way that they interact with one another is something that's kind of difficult to parse. There's room for discussion. Remind me, what are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? What are the 5 criteria in the CRAAP test? Let's start with C. C, yeah, C is for not cookie, but currency. Yeah, C is for currency. And what does that mean?
Like, if it was up to date.
Yeah, is the information up to date? Is there something like more up to date than this already? If it's old, then I want to at least look at whether or not there's something newer that might be more hip to new information that the old thing wasn't hip to, right? All right, so that's fairly important. Relevance. This should not be new to us. We've been talking about relevance ever since we started talking about induction. Relevance refers to what? Relevant to what? Yeah, what you're trying to, yeah, if you're doing research, by the time you've made it to the library, presumably you're not just there because, I don't know, because your mom like dropped you off and wants to go to Pilates or something like that. You're at the library because you have a question. You have something that you're trying to do. Maybe it's an assignment that somebody else gave you. Maybe, who knows, you're genuinely curious and you decided, I'll go to a library to help try to answer a question. But you've got some question. Is this source relevant to the question that you're trying to answer? Okay. A, oh, I'm supposed to be doing these. Let you guess them. So we got a C, we got an R. A, did anybody see it? It flashed up there ever so briefly. Authority, yeah. Authority, and this is what we were talking about on last week on Friday's meeting, appeals to authority and how it is that we determine whether or not somebody speaks with authority, that when they say something, we have a tendency to believe them even if they haven't explained themselves yet. It's the mere fact that they're saying it that gives me reason to say, like, I think that that's probably true, or it moves me in the direction of believing it because the source comes with authority. And we talked about how this can be misused and it can be abused, but we talked about essentially what makes it tick. The short answer to whether or not somebody is an authority is whether or not they have the relevant experience to have that authority. And the longer answer is, well, it's really, really complicated to determine who has the relevant experience on some particular matter. That's one A. There was another A, because it's a CRAAP test. What's the other A? Accuracy, which I got to be honest with you guys, this is the one I'm like the least impressed with. Really, accuracy? If I knew how to assess accuracy, I wouldn't be asking the questions in the first place. But yeah, this maybe if we wanted to kind of lean in something a more helpful direction, I might say something like evidence. Do they offer evidence? Then it would be like a CREAP test, maybe, but that's not as fun. I guess we're going to have to let the acronym determine like what our criteria. This is why I don't like these things, because now they're like, oh, we need another A, so it's CRAAP. And you're like, oh, let's say accuracy. That's not helpful. Evidence, justification. would maybe be better, so you get nice Dutch words like CRAAP with like CRAJP. I don't know if that's actually a Dutch word. It looks like it could be. But yeah, this is what accuracy is referring to. It's this question of like, do I have good reason to believe that this is well backed up information? Not just, is it true? Is it true is like a harder thing to settle. That's what this whole class is about. How do you determine whether or not you should think something is true? And then last but not least, I did it again. Purpose. Very good. You read's good. So yeah, purpose is our last one. And this is similar to relevance, but I guess we have to do it again so it spells crap. But yeah, purpose. What purpose? What are you trying to do? Maybe not even necessarily what you're trying to do. Yeah. Also maybe the author. What do you think the author was trying to do? So maybe this does belong in something different than relevance. We can think about this as my goals and aims, and does it fit with what I'm trying to do? And this is like, what was the author's goal and aim? What question were they trying to answer? Because it might be slightly different than mine. And that doesn't mean that it's not useful, that their question and the way they answer it isn't relevant to my question and the way that I answer it. But it's something to keep in mind. All right, CRAAP test. Cool. And the example that the librarians gave us was a journalistic example, which kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but maybe leads us into today's question, which is specifically if we're talking about the media, we're talking about journalistic sources. Can we trust those? And under what conditions can we trust them? If I ask people, like, can I trust it? I'm just kind of curious. If I said, like, can I trust the media? What's your initial response? You guys are, yeah. Folks aren't so hot on the media these days. I think that some of this judgment is a little bit sloppy. And let's start just by kind of pointing out that, like, the media is a huge group, from people who make movies to people who make music to people who make websites, people who print newspapers. The media is like all kinds of things. Can you trust the media? You want me to make a generalization about this gigantic group? Perhaps the answer is the same answer that we get with can I trust X every single time. Sometimes yes and sometimes no. It depends. Trust the trustworthy media. Don't trust the untrustworthy media. Thanks, Rosenfeld. That's really helpful. But like this is like, first let's just dispense with this idea of making kind of blanket dismissals of the entirety of the ways that like information gets to us. I used to, back when I was in graduate school, I took on a job teaching in a journalism department. They were doing a news literacy program, and for a couple of years I taught that. And very first question that we asked students on like day one was like, so what sort of news media do you like? Tell me about your news media consumption habits. What do you read? And almost everybody said like, I don't really read the news. I don't mess with the media. Bullshit. Like you get it all the time. It's all around you. Like you are getting information. If you dispense with the idea of like getting information from other people, you're just not going to know anything. You're going to be limited to like just what's in your immediate surroundings. You won't even find out that like your cousin had a baby on the other side. Like that came through media. So like, should I trust the media? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. We're going to get some bullet points here for things to think about when you're wondering about whether or not you should trust the media. We're going to dive deeper into a couple of issues. One's going to have to do with labeling and different kinds of media, and whether or not, kind of back to that purpose question, whether or not something is an appropriate piece of journalistic media for the purpose that it's designed for, and how can you distinguish between those purposes. We're going to talk a little bit about fairness, balance, and bias. We'll dig a little deeper on that. And then we'll have a little activity that we're going to do, in which I've pulled a whole bunch of, 6 different journalistic outlets. We got Breitbart, we got Fox News, we got the New York Times, we got BBC, we got Al Jazeera English, we got NPR. I think that's all of them. I just picked like their top story this morning, like the most prominently, not like the one that people were clicking on the most, but the one that they were displaying the most prominently on their website, and we'll work through these in small groups. Before I get started, give me a sense. How many times have you heard this spiel? Like, are like people constantly inundating you with like, you need to learn how to use news media properly? Sometimes. Kenneth Hips, yeah, you've heard it before. So this might be yet another lecture from an older person saying like, you guys got to be careful here. why, like, is it serious? Like, why is it important that you learn how to use news media properly?
That's a huge resource that you can use.
It's a huge resource, yeah. What if you don't use it? What if you don't use it wisely? You can go, yeah, you might end up going to Pizza Hut with guns, right? Yeah, to try to, yeah, not Pizza Hut, Carousel Pizza, right? Yeah. Let's not fall into fake news. Now we're spreading rumors about Pizza Hut, right? But can we all get, like, when I say fake news, this is a buzzword. You've heard this before. This is a very dangerous idea if used clumsily, and it is being used very clumsily. If we get into this idea that like anything that I disagree with is fake news, and that's starting to be like how the term is drifting. Not talking about The Onion, not talking about like some teenager in Macedonia who's just making up stories so that they can get clicks. Like CNN, BuzzFeed, not great news, but fake news. The New York Times, the Washington Post, various like what used to be respected news media outlets being called fake news, as if it's the sort of thing that like I can just dismiss it out of hand. CNN reports something, I'm like, I don't have to look at that, that's fake news. That is incredibly dangerous. And hopefully we've been getting some sense in this course that like the tools that we're developing are designed to try to break this down, to try to get us into like the sorts of situations where I can have productive, competent conversations with people, even if I disagree with them. And this whole dismissal of opposing viewpoints is like completely anathema to that project. It's also something that's really, really important now, perhaps more than ever, because the technological mediation of like the way that we get our information is such that it makes it so easy to get sucked into a bubble, to like only see the sorts of things that you agree with and never see the sorts of things that you disagree with. So we have to try even harder than we like used to in a kind of Wild West media where there's like all kinds of shit going on and it all gets treated more or less evenly, which is perhaps a mistake. Like this is a recipe for disaster if what we expect is that a healthy democracy requires informed citizens. I don't think that's like too cheesy of a sentiment, by the way, to believe that a healthy democracy needs informed citizens. It needs us to, like, even when we disagree about the sorts of conclusions that we're drawing, to at least have a common pool of premises that we can say, these are plausible, we can start our arguments here. Because if we can't find that, then it seems like conversation between disagreeing parties just gets harder and harder and harder. So this is like the background for this. Like our ability to have competent conversations with our neighbors hangs in the balance of our ability to use news media well. Can they be doing a better job? Yeah, sure. Can we be doing a better job of reading and using them? Oh, hell yeah. Because it's a business. Like it's like media markets are capitalistic economic free markets. We get exactly what we pay for. If we reward shitty journalism, we can't be surprised if that's what we get. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys pay for your news? Josh pays for his news. Where do you mind saying? Like New York Times? You have a subscription to the New York Times? Anybody else pay for news at all? That shit ain't free to make. So if you insist on getting free news, understand that you're going to be getting exactly what you paid for. All right. Rant over. Can I trust the media? Step one, look for labels. You've got to look for labels to try to determine what sort of media neighborhood you're in. Media is just like how information gets from one person to another. Reading the reviews on Amazon.com for a product that you're interested in, that shit's media. You should know like what you're getting into. You should understand like what's going on in the review section on an Amazon page and understand that like this is a very particular kind of medium and I should approach it in a certain way. It's going to kind of determine like certain purposes that it's good for, certain ones that it's not very good for, certain sorts of criteria for trying to evaluate the authoritativeness of the people who are speaking, etc., etc., etc. Have you ever like seen a review? Yelp is really bad about this. You ever seen a review from somebody like brand new restaurant in town? They're like 5 stars. I hope to go there soon. And you're just like 5 stars. I hope to go there soon. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. You haven't eaten here. 5 stars. How do you come up with that shit? So like yeah, like that's. Pay attention to those neighborhoods. That's almost a trivial one, but like, no, am I looking at news? Is what I'm looking at not quite the same as like straight reporting? Is it opinion? Is it news analysis? Is it a blog? If I'm expecting straight reporting and opinion to, like, if I'm not making that distinction, then I'm going to handle this very sloppily, right? I'll treat opinion as if it were news, or I'll treat news as if I think it's opinion. Is this a press release? Is it an advertisement? Are we all hip to the idea that, like, folks will dress up advertisements to look like news articles? You've seen them? Weak nodding. I have to point to a picture now. So yeah, something like this. Exposed, Virginia mom makes $8,000 per month, and you won't believe how she does it. It has all the trappings of a news article. It looks like a news article. It's clearly not, though, right? It's an ad. Trying to get you to click on, I blurred it out because I didn't even want you to see that shit. Like, it's toxic. If anybody ever says, like, this person made, like, tons and tons of money without doing anything, you won't believe how they did it. I'm always thinking to myself, like, you're right. I'm not going to believe how they did it. So, be aware of what neighborhood you're in, and be aware of whether or not the media outlet is labeling it for you. If they are labeling it for you, that is a great sign. It means they are trying to help you use their product competently. If they are not labeling these things, then you should be concerned. One of the reasons why they might be labeling these things is because they want to obfuscate the distinctions between these different sorts of neighborhoods, these different sorts of purposes that media can be put to. Does the headline match the article? This is huge. We started to talk about this a little bit at our last meeting with the librarians. Look for whether or not the headline actually gets supported in what comes next in the article. If it doesn't, then this seems to suggest that this is not a very well-written piece. Like, why would you claim something in the headline? The headline is their claim, right? The headline is like, if any news article is going to be an argument, and I think we can look at them as arguments. Headline's the conclusion, and then everything else in the article is supposed to support that conclusion. If it doesn't get supported, that's a real problem. Also be on the lookout for clickbaity or just kind of overly editorialized headlines. So these kind of like, you wouldn't believe, like, click here to like find out more, and then it takes you through a listicle where you have to click for each item of the list, right? This is to try to get ad revenue. This is not trying to inform you necessarily. Or if they're trying to inform you, it's secondary to whether or not they can get ad revenue. So look out for those clickbaity titles. Look out for overly editorialized ones too, especially when they're not supported. How many times have you seen a headline that's something like, there was one just this morning, Shepard Smith eviscerates GOP talking points on Obamacare repeal. You guys know who Shepard Smith is? He's an anchor for Fox News. Shepard Smith eviscerates, I'm expecting to see something really big. And you go down and you like watch the clip from Shep's show. He asked 3 questions. He was like, these are the questions we need to be asking. Eviscerates? Are you kidding me? Headline and the article don't match. This is a sure sign that like there might be some intent to mislead. Also look out for headlines that are questions rather than claims. There's a kind of a rule about this. Like if the headline's a question, it's almost like asking that question rhetorically gets you to think maybe the answer might be yes. Check this out. Next time you see an article with a headline that's a question, see what the answer to the question is. It's almost always no. Why? Because if the answer was yes, they wouldn't have run a headline that was a question. They would have said, like, how would we say this? Is there any truth to the rumors that Obama was wiretapping Trump before the election? Question mark. Oh, maybe yes, maybe no. If there was news, if there was evidence of this, you would expect that would be what they lead with, right? New evidence that Obama wiretapped Trump before the election. Since they're asking a question, you should be prepared to, like, this probably suggests that the answer is no, and they were trying to get you hooked before they told you the answer was no. Is there any biased language, not only in the headline, but in the rest of the article? Beware of that. Is there fairness and balance? And we'll talk more about fairness, balance, and bias in just a second, but be aware of that stuff. It's important to think about. Here's something that's huge. The article is going to say things, and it's going to back some of those up with evidence. What isn't being said, though? Be aware of like what is not in the article. Sometimes things aren't in the article just because The article can't do everything at once. It's got to focus on one thing at a time. But you might be wondering, like, there's some background information that I need in order to interpret this properly. Or this leads me to new questions about something else. So what isn't being said there that then is going to drive me, perhaps, to go seek out new information? That's always a good sign when you go from this kind of passive news consumption, the newspaper landed on my patio, I picked it up and I read it, versus like, now I have a question and I'm off like on the internet or in the library, if I'm old school, trying to find an answer. That sort of active engagement is always going to be better than a passive engagement. You'll have more control over the sorts of media that you're examining and consuming. So yeah, what isn't being said? What's going to drive you to like new questions? What isn't being said because it was information that was just not available to the reporter at the time? And did they like try to show you that like I tried to get it? I tried to get the information. We reached out to this party whose like opinion on this matter that we're reporting on is very important. We reached out to them for a statement, but they just didn't get back to us by press time. That's plausible. But now I've got questions of like, well, what is their position on this? And if they never get back to the reporter, then maybe this informs how anxious I am about not getting their perspective. It's not that we didn't try to get it. It's not that we didn't give them an opportunity to give their perspective. They just refused it. Also things that like maybe are just, the author doesn't tell you that they tried to get them but they couldn't. It's just information that's missing still. Be aware of these things too. They're very important. Sometimes it's sinister. Sometimes it's just an artifact of the fact that news is the first draft, right? It's always the best available information that we have at the time, and this is evolving. Transparency, which gets into this question of like, what aren't they telling you, and have they explained why they're not telling you this? Transparency refers to the practice by which a journalist tells you not only what they know, but how they know it. They've kind of pulled back the curtain on their thought process. Every reporter is doing their best, if they're a good reporter. Every good reporter is doing their best to give you a sense of, like, they were wondering, like, what's going on? They went and tried to find out what's going on, and then they come back and they say, according to, like, what I saw, here's what seems to be going on. If they can show you how it was that they came to those conclusions, this is good. I no longer have to trust in their authority or that they're giving me an honest perspective on things. I get to look at how they came to that conclusion, and I can make up my own mind a little bit more. I don't have to rely on that appeal to authority as much. So transparency, hugely important. How do they know what they know? And why don't they know what they don't know? And last but not least, context. There's just no such thing as a naked fact that is meaningful. It always demands some sort of context. And we can change the way that a narrative looks just by shifting the context a little bit here. This is going to get into questions of bias and the fact that, like, inevitably we have to frame any story some way. We have to give some sort of perspective. We can do everything we can to make sure that we balance different perspectives or that we give fair treatment to different perspectives. But there's going to have to be some way of contextualizing information if this is going to be usable information, something more than just raw data. And a good article provides context in such a way that I'm able to make sense of it without necessarily, well, depending on the kind of news it is, maybe without necessarily kind of nudging me down the road of a particular interpretation. Or maybe sometimes we do want to be nudged down the road of a particular interpretation. And this gets into actually this question about like different kinds of purposes that news media or journalistic media get put to. So let's dig a little bit deeper on that for just a second. This starts with the basic news versus opinion distinction. That's since like I first started learning about this, it's gotten way, way muddier. Used to be in newspapers. Way, way back in the day. I'm sure your parents and grandparents told you all about it. Used to be when people read newspapers, there was a whole section devoted just to opinions and editorials and political cartoons. All the shit where somebody had an axe to grind was quarantined to this one section, and all the rest of the paper was just straight reporting. And news organizations made really, really strong efforts to make sure that like there was as little communication as humanly possible between the news desk and the opinion or the editorial desk. That like those two groups of people, they were working for the same company, but we didn't want to have any kind of cross-pollination. We didn't want to kind of infect, I guess, our straight news with any of the opinions. And this is why you have folks who will talk about that, like certain journalistic outlets, particularly newspapers, that their editorial and opinion pages certainly have a lean, but their reporting doesn't necessarily have that lean. Or at least this is what's aspired to. This is what a lot of organizations still do go for. And when they label it for us, they're kind of, I think they're giving us a good sense of the idea that there could very well be trustworthy. It's a good sign when a media outlet labels the kind of thing for the kind of medium that we're looking at for us. So for example, if I'm looking at something like straight investigative reporting, a kind of just the facts approach to reporting, I know I'm not going to get just the facts. There's going to be a little bit of context. There's going to be a little bit of framing. But we're all the way down here on like this end of the spectrum of making very, very cautious inferences. You're never going to see a news article that makes zero inferences at all, but the straight investigative reporting should make as few as possible, and they should be really, really confident. They should be the sorts of things that, like, we're not taking very many risks on making any inferences from the data that's available. Then we'll if we kind of move a little bit in this direction of doing things that are more interpretive and taking bigger risks in our inferences, we get into something that's called news analysis, and sometimes it's labeled as such. News analysis isn't quite opinion or an editorial. It's somebody who's saying, like, here's the just the facts stuff from the straight investigative reporting, and now we're going to put it in a little bit more context. I'm going to try to like tell a story. Usually this is the same sort of thing that you'll get in a literature review, in academic research. A news analysis piece will frequently look at a whole bunch of different articles and try to tell a longer arcing story. First we found this out, then we found this out, then we found this out. It looks like this is how this story is developing and evolving. Opinion and editorial and blogs, these are places where the authors have free rein to make bigger, somewhat bolder inferences, and frequently with a particular sort of sensibility, political sensibility, or some other sort of, these are places where we think bias is maybe more expected to creep in. And we'll talk about like what we do when we suspect that there's bias creeping in. But this is where we'll see this. And then on the far end, and I'll suggest that like, I don't know how much usefulness there is for this. This is really useful. This is a huge resource that we can have access to as long as we know how to use it well. As we go this way, it becomes easier and easier to use because the inferences that are being made are way safer. When we get into territory of what one of my old journalism professors called bloviation, or like what we all know as propaganda, these are places where like concern for truthful conclusions has just gone out the window. We're just making noise now. We're trying to manipulate people through rhetoric and emotional appeals and stuff like that. Very little attention to whether or not the inferences that are being made are reliable. That's at the far end. And so we have this spectrum. To call it all the same just seems to be a mistake, a failure to make important distinctions. And we should know like what all these things are doing. If we know how they work, we're going to know how to use them. Amen.
So as far as consumption goes nowadays on the spectrum, do you want people gravitate toward the editorial blogs?
I think a lot of people just don't distinguish. They just think it's all the news. So they'll say like they'll see an editorial, they'll see some piece of straight investigative reporting, or maybe they'll see an editorial from the New York Times, and they'll say like that seems like it has a real liberal slant. And then they'll see some investigative reporting from the New York Times, and they'll be like, the New York Times is liberal and biased. I'm not going to pay attention to that story. Well, if you can't distinguish between when the Times is doing opinion stuff and when it's doing straight reporting, you're not going to be a reliable judge of when their reporting is reliable. And I would say even if you aren't sympathetic to like, I don't know, like a liberal leaning sensibility, you should still be reading the opinions of people who do have those sensibilities, right? This is how you stay out of your bubble. Gavin.
When we see things like Breitbart and, just, it can be in either side that's obviously just not true, but is being forced to, or not being forced, but is being used to push a certain candidate or position.
Now, not true at all, or some true things, some things that we're not sure about, and definitely trying to at least suggest drawing a conclusion that might not be that reliable?
Yes.
Yes.
But in extreme levels.
In extreme levels.
You can tell when things are extreme.
Well, I'm not sure if I
When they're
can.
making more inferences
Yeah, so that would be one way. Yeah, if their inferences are like
Right, exactly.
somewhat reckless, and if there are many of
Why
them.
are we not calling that propaganda?
Because I want to make because I want to make it. Yeah, I want to make a distinction between people who are giving their honest take on things, and where we've said like, here's a forum for you to kind of loosen up a little bit and make bolder inferences, and folks who aren't really interested in an honest exchange of ideas. This seems like it's operating in a different sort of register, where like we're not inviting discussion, we're not even participating in discussion. I'm using language or I'm using media in a way that is designed to manipulate rather than start or participate in a conversation. So there might, like, it's a spectrum, right? There's stuff in here that's just kind of like, ooh, I'm not sure where it goes. Is it important that I put it in one category or another? Not as important as recognizing that if it's somewhere between opinion and propaganda, then I should be, what? More cautious than I would be with opinion, less cautious than I would be with propaganda.
I guess
Yeah.
my question is, why do you think that news outlets aren't like pointing out the fact that not only is this fake news, but this is the fake news in this sense?
Are you talking specifically with particular... What do you mean it takes all the fun out of it for them? Nobody wants to say that this is fake news, right? Also, I think it's a dangerous precedent to set, where like one news outlet calls another news outlet fake news. Also, I don't think if your example was Breitbart, I don't think it's fake news. I think it's news with like an axe to grind for sure, and I think it is careless with the way that it kind of like blurs the lines between like what on its website are blogs and what on its website is like good reporting. We'll try to make sure that you get the Breitbart article today and look at it and tell me if you think like this is just something that I can dismiss out of hand. Because that's actually the next thing that I want to talk about. I want to talk about bias and fairness and balance, because they're also terms that are like tossed around willy-nilly as if they're very easy to understand and use. But I find that they're used really, really clumsily and really badly, and sometimes in a very harmful way. Let's start with balance. This is like the Fox News tagline, fair and balanced. Fair and balanced. Can it be both? What do you mean by balance? What do you mean by fairness? Let's start with balance. Balance is really straightforward. It's like your Fisher-Price, my first version of fairness sort of thing. Balance means equal time, equal weight, equal tone when I'm representing various competing perspectives in a story. So if I'm doing a story on, Obamacare repeal, I want to have equal time, equal weight, equal space maybe if it's print instead of equal time or space, equal weight, and equal tone when I'm talking about those who oppose Obamacare repeal versus those who support Obamacare repeal. I want to have that if I'm going to have balance. Like I say, it's a clumsy first stab at fairness. Sometimes it's the best game in town. Sometimes an issue is so new that like balance is the best that we can do. But fairness is not the same as like equal time, equal weight, equal tone. Fairness is not treating everybody. I saw some eyes get scrunchy. This is maybe an important point. Fairness is not the same as everybody gets treated equally. Have you ever heard or seen, maybe even been, a small child complaining that it's not fair that you don't get to do the things that the grown-ups get to do? If an 8-year-old is complaining that it's not fair that they have to go to bed earlier than a 35-year-old, what do we think of that claim? It's a little bit silly? Yeah. Because fairness isn't everybody gets treated exactly the same. Fairness is everybody gets treated appropriately. What's that? Who measures whether it's appropriate? We all do. It's something that we have to negotiate and figure out. But we can at least identify that fairness and balance aren't necessarily going to be the same thing. This is sometimes you'll hear folks talk about false equivalency. False equivalency is when I go for balance instead of fairness when the two are diverging. Sometimes they are the same thing. Sometimes a fair article is also going to be a balanced article. But for example, and this is a handy example that gets used all the time when talking about fairness and how it differs from balance. It's not the case that every time I write a journalistic article about the Holocaust, I have to give equal time and equal weight and equal space to Holocaust deniers. That's just ridiculous. Can we all agree with that? So it's a matter, yeah, if what we see is there are two perspectives, but one of them is clearly better supported than the other, then don't present them as if they're on par with one another. That's not honest. That's not like good reporting. It's not fair reporting. It's not fair reporting to make it look like a well justified position is to be taken as seriously as a very poorly justified decision. And sometimes this is just a matter of kind of standing the test of time. And this is why brand new breaking stories where we're not really sure like what the truth is just yet, we're going to kind of err more on the side of balance. Or things where like we have no idea whether one side is better or worse supported than the other. Or it seems even they're both making a case. Then I want to give equal time, equal weight, equal tone. But without going into like too many like current examples, I think there are like clear cases where there seems to be some sort of dispute going on. For example, we can take like climate change reporting. There are climate deniers, and some of them complain that like in the press we don't get enough attention to climate denial. Or sometimes we'll talk about like creationists wishing that like teachers, biology teachers in public schools would teach the controversy instead of teaching one position versus another. Like there is no scientific controversy between creationism and evolution. One of them's a scientific theory, one of them's not. One of them belongs in a biology classroom, one of them doesn't. One of these positions on kind of accepting scientific consensus on climate change and rejecting scientific consensus on climate change. These two positions are not equally well supported. And for a journalist to give them equal time and equal space and equal weight is to represent things as other than they are. Is there room for contention? Like people might disagree about this? Oh yeah. And because of this, we might want to be a little more subtle in the way that we approach the difference between fairness and balance. If we're always demanding balance, clearly that's a problem. If we're not sensitive enough to the fact that pursuing fairness maybe is susceptible to bias, then I might think that I'm doing something fair, but really I'm just representing my own point of view and not giving enough attention to opposing points of view that do need to be taken more seriously. That's a problem too. Fairness it's a virtuous mean. It's hard to hit. And it's hard to kind of describe with like a recipe ahead of time. Last but not least, bias. And Amy mentioned this at our last meeting. First thing about bias, everybody's got it. It can't be avoided. Bias is really, it's just your perspective. It's a predisposition to judge things in a certain way rather than in another way. We have tons of biases that are incredibly helpful, and they enable us to navigate the world without getting killed. A bias that leads you to expect that the future is going to be more or less like the past has been is the sort of thing that, like, without that, you probably die. Some biases are more harmful, though, but you can't escape them. You see the world a certain way, and other people see it a different way. We've all got our biases. Good journalists do what they can to try to minimize those biases by trying to, like, be more balanced, by trying to err on the side of balance as opposed to fairness, but still trying to negotiate the two, by trying to make sure that like all of the claims that they make are really well sourced, etc., etc. Bias is a psychological predisposition. It's a psychological state, and there are only a couple of ways that I think you can make a justifiable claim that a source is biased. One, you can demonstrate a long track record of making certain decisions in a certain way. For example, if anybody's done like some media literacy stuff, you might be aware that there's a phenomenon, especially in television news, that stories about kidnapped young women, when those young women are pretty, and when they're white, and when they're blonde, those stories get way more press than when they're not pretty, or when they're not white, or even when they're not blonde. This is a bias that like almost all television reporting succumbs to, and it's not the sort of thing that you can casually accuse. You have to look at a lot of data and show that like this is how much airtime like these different cases, these different stories got, this is how much airtime these different stories got. You basically got to do like some Mills method shit, where you got to kind of look at an awful lot of data and try to pick apart like what sorts of causal relationships there might be. Sometimes folks want to go to an accusation of bias by kind of speculating about somebody's motives. Be careful with this. This is a really, really dangerous sort of inference to make. You have no access to somebody's psychological state or what their motives are. Sometimes you can figure it out by what they say. If they write a memo that says something like, we will not we will not use the word climate change, like, in any of our reporting, because we want to, like, cast doubt on climate science. That memo exists. That's a pretty good piece of evidence of bias, but, like, how often do you see a memo like that, right? Try not to speculate too much about other people's psychological states. Suspected bias, by the way, which is pretty much what we only ever really get, is that, like, I'm suspicious that there might be bias. To prove it is really, really hard. Or to even, like, support it really well is really, really hard. But if there's suspected bias, a lot of times our tendency is to just kind of dismiss the source out of hand. No. That is not what suspected bias allows you to do. Suspected bias gives you cause to have heightened scrutiny, to pay closer attention, to maybe say, like, I need to balance this out by seeing the take from somebody who's got a countervailing bias or somebody who has less bias. But not to dismiss it out of hand. This is how we end up in this territory where, like, we don't have shareable facts anymore. When folks start saying, like, that's biased, they're not careful about that accusation of bias, and on top of that, they completely dismiss the source and anything that the source is saying because it's biased. This is drifting now into, like, genetic ad hominem territory. And we've already discussed why this is not good reasoning. Yep.
How do you feel about the claim that the news or informative news media is
That the news media is beating a dead horse? Like when they peddle on a story for a really long time? Even if it's like there's no new news to find in it?
that, I guess, in general, whether it's celebrity news or local party news or designer news?
That there's too much reporting on those sorts of things? First, I would say, and the question was, like, what do I say about complaints that the news just kind of, like, overrepresents certain sorts of stories? So I'll start out by saying, like, where are you getting your news from? Because different news sources will report on different sorts of things. Maybe if you're going to read Tiger Beat and you're like, ugh, Tiger Beat always, like, publishes stories about, like, boy bands and cute boys. Like, I wish there was less reporting on boy bands and cute boys. We might say, like, well, stop reading Tiger Beat. If you're like, all these stories are about, like, boring economic issues. And what are you reading? The Economist. Well, no shit, right? Yeah. The whole industry? Well, let's not do this thing where we kind of, like, with a broad brush, paint the whole industry the same color. Because there's incredible variation within this industry. Yeah. So part of it is if you find news outlets that are not reporting on things that you think are important and are reporting on things that are unimportant, stop using them. Definitely don't pay them. Don't give them the, like, ad revenue. Like,
I mean, like, reporting not just the
I don't know how much clearer I can make it that I am not interested in making broad generalizations about reporting, because they're all different kinds. But if we think that there's too much news that's reporting on, like, too many inconsequential things, we might look no further than ourselves. Like, this is the shit that we reward. I don't know if I've, like, been candid enough in this conversation. I've taken some pretty bold positions. I think I can back them up. But, like, we can start with, like, cable news. Cable news is, like, even if you knew nothing about cable news, if you just saw their model, you might say to yourself, like, this is a shitty way to do news. We have 24 hours in a day. No matter what's happening or how important it might be, we are going to fill 24 hours of airtime every day. Man, you're going to end up with, like, 24 hours of coverage about some lost Malaysian plane that they haven't found yet. And people are going to be speculating. You think they're going to find it? Well, I don't know. You're like, oh, we're looking for it. What do you think, Bob? And Bob says, like, well, I hope they find it, because if they don't, then all the people are probably dead. And then, whoa, what do you think, Patty? And Patty says, like, the people are already probably dead. And you're like, what? Like, what? There's no news. Nothing's going on here, right? Or it might focus on celebrity news or stuff like that. Or it might focus on politics, and I'm not interested in politics. I think you probably should be a little more interested in politics. But yeah, running the same sorts of stories over and over and over again. Sometimes it's because the stories are evolving. That, like, it's a little bit of more information each time. And this is why we get an awful lot. Okay. So can I trust the news media? The answer is obviously it depends, like all forms of trust. Trust the trustworthy things. Don't trust the untrustworthy things. And also be aware of this. Journalism is a process. They don't call it the first draft of history for nothing. You're always getting the best available version of the facts on any given day with any sort of journalistic article. You've got to follow a story over time if you want to get a full sense of what's going on. If you want to have some sense of what the context for any journalistic article is, you need to be following stories over time. One article is hardly ever enough to get some reliable, actionable information, the kind of stuff that you can make decisions about whether to vote, decisions about whether to go protest, decisions about whether to call your legislator, like decisions about like whether you're going to step in and say something next time your neighbor says some like dumbass shit that you disagree with. Like, you need more than one story. This is a process that unfolds. And it kind of goes between journalistic outlets too. Never rely on just one story. Never rely on just one journalistic outlet. That just seems foolish. Get lots of different perspectives on something. Not saying anything new here, am I? But yet we don't seem to use this tool very well. Maybe it takes a little bit more concerted effort. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at articles.